Wow, what a compliant group. You know, I actually learned that technique from an auctioneer because so often you go to events and people tap microphones and people are yap, 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 but there's something inborn with us that when they hear a shh, that everybody seems to quiet down. Hi, my name is Richard Weiss. I'm the former president of the Explorers Club, and I'd like to welcome you in person to the Explorers Club. It's such a joy to see people right here. And part of the reason I felt that real joy is that there's such a tradition of storytelling. Just didn't start at the Explorers Club. You know, ever since people emerged from caves or trees or wherever we came from, there was always that one person who stood over a fire and said, "You'll never guess what happened to me. You'll never guess what I saw." And that tradition, I feel, is very much alive today in different mediums. I find like Zoom is the new sort of metaphorical fire that people sometimes stand over. But being in person is really great, too. Now, tonight we have a historic climber who's going to speak. And, you know, I think that this is such a fitting place because if I think about whose arms or hands have been on this lectern, you know, you'll get chills from Sir Edmund Hillary to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Jane Goodall, and the list goes on and on and on and on. And so the stories, if these walls could talk, well, I suppose if they could talk and they talk too much, you'd be annoyed. But the stories that, you know, that have been told in here are just unbelievable. In fact, people have always, I guess, compared the Explorers Club to sort of like a Hogwarts for adults. And honest to God, you know, explorers are really good storytellers, and it always seems like one story tops the next story. And I remember we were sitting down at the lounge once, and we were talking about solar eclipses, the aurora borealis, and, you know, to see a really good aurora borealis is a cool event. I'm sure. Who here has seen one? I'm sure quite a few of them. Yeah, I would figure this group would. It's a pretty amazing event. So this one guy, last name Hatfield from Canada, goes, "Well, I did a spacewalk over an aurora borealis of my country of Canada." So how do you top that story? You know, it's pretty hard, but I think tonight we might have that opportunity. All right, I'm not going to introduce Rick, but we are going to have somebody from the New Yorker, Nick Paumgarten, and I have my own story with Nick. Nick actually profiled me in the New Yorker about, I think we figured, what was it, Nick, 15 years ago? Something like that. I had been asked to do a television filming in Mexico on a high volcano. I can't remember whether it was Ixtaccíhuatl or Popocatépetl, but 18,000 feet. And, you know, the TV people said, "Oh, yeah, well, we could do this in 2 or 3 days." And I'm like, I live at sea level. And I figured, how can I hack this thing? And I found out that there was a company in Manhattan that was creating these enclosures for rooms so people could do hypoxic training. And so I had my office desk enclosed in a hypoxic setting. And, you know, every day I would sit in there at 14,000 feet. So Nick came and he said, "Oh, I'd love to come in there and experience altitude sickness." And Rick, I'm sure that's not one thing you like to experience, and you've had it more than once. So we actually played poker. But the funny thing about this story, and Nick remembered it, was that the owner was this Russian guy who looked a lot like Putin. He had the silk suit, you know, about the same height. And his niece, and I kid you not, I remember her name, his niece, was the first Miss. I think she really was his niece. She really was his niece. She was the first Miss USSR. She was in her 20s or 30s, you know, tall, blonde, very Russian. And so he's getting hypoxic in there playing cards with me. And suddenly, you know, like Dr. No walks in there with a James Bond girl. And it's like, "No, Nick, you're going to die." So without further ado, and you could see explorers are storytellers. I'm no exception. Nick Paumgarten is going to introduce Rick Ridgeway. So, Nick, good to see you. I haven't seen you in 15 years. You haven't aged either. You look great, by the way.
Hello, yeah, I'm going to just feel the vibes from this lectern here, you know. Good to see everybody. 5 years ago, I wrote a long profile of Yvon Chouinard. He's the Patagonia founder and Rick's longtime compadre. I don't usually get to write about people I admire so plainly. A few summers later, the editors of The New Yorker stuck me with Andrew Cuomo. There are a lot of benefits to doing a story about Yvon. A road trip in Montana with empty wine bottles rolling around in the back of his truck. 4 days trout fishing on the Bighorn with some of his friends. We cooked each other meals and emptied more wine bottles. We even played tennis. But one of the great pleasures of reporting that story was getting to know Rick Ridgeway. We had 2 long conversations. Hello. The first was in Ventura at Patagonia headquarters. Hey, I'd have to talk like this. At that time, he was in charge of environmental affairs there and was busting his butt traveling the world to get the big apparel manufacturers to clean up their act. That was inspiring enough, but as we talked, we were sitting a few yards away from where his young granddaughter was tooling around in an outdoor playground at the on-site Patagonia daycare center that his wife Jennifer had founded 30 years earlier with Melinda Chouinard. That had been a revolutionary and badass thing in itself. The granddaughter's mother, Rick and Jennifer's daughter, had been the first kid there. This was 1985, and this is the dark ages. Daycare was barely even an existing term. But the way he beamed about that little girl, man, he was such a warm and gentle and emotionally open presence, maybe a slight contrast to Yvon Chouinard. Now, I'm not a climber, I'm not an adventurer, I'm not an explorer. I don't even ever call myself a storyteller. But I've spent a lot of time as a writer and as a fanboy around hardcore mountain people. They tend to be a pretty flinty bunch. Cocksure, fierce, egotistical, intolerant of us flatlanders with all of our whining about risk and those ungodly early starts. Having read Rick's book and knowing something of his story, I get the sense that he has, or had, at least a little of that in him too. He had to do the things he did, or to run with the crew he ran with. But in person, in conversation, he struck me then as a less... It's easier. Where was I? Right. Flinty, yes. Right, so Rick had to have some of that in him, right? I mean, come on. In person, he's great, but I don't even need it at this point. It might be easier.
You need it. He might.
To do the things. No, my point is that even though Rick is this really sweet guy, we know that at some point he had to have that flinty, egotistical side to him. Having read his book, knowing something of his story, a man has to have that to do what he did and to run with the crew that he ran with. But in person and conversation, he struck me then as a less restless, more present version of that species, one who had taken the lessons of the mountains to heart. And what had he done in those mountains? Well, I assume since you're here, you know the answer to that question. It's a lot. He's a California kid who started out scrambling in the San Gabriel Mountains. He cut his tooth in the Peruvian Andes. He sailed to Tahiti, did a short stint in a Panamanian jail. It was a scheme involving ammo and emeralds. Don't ask. Or do, when the time comes. He bailed on a PhD program at Cal Berkeley and a life as a professor to join an Everest expedition, and later summited K2 as part of the first American expedition to do so. He wrote countless articles and a half-dozen books. That's a lot. Shot photos and films, started and sold a successful stock film and photo business, And along the way, he kept cooking up and not dying on all kinds of new adventures all over the world, increasingly with the goal of saving the world rather than just conquering it. Many of these trips are in this new memoir, Life Lived Wild. Read it. It's a beauty. He also made countless friends, evolved and grew as a man, I suppose. It seems so in the book. And sustained a beautiful marriage and a beautiful family. It has been, more than anything else, a life lived well. The second time we met was in Manhattan over lunch. He was on his way back from the annual meeting of the Sustainability Apparel Coalition. About the state of the world, he said, "Yvonne is a pessimist, but I'm an optimist." Remember, this was 2016. And then the conversation got heavy. He began to talk about grief and loss. He told me the story of a doomed climbing expedition to Tibet in 1980, where an avalanche took the life of his good friend and tent mate, the photographer Jonathan Wright. I think we may hear about some of that later. Rick and Yvonne barely survived in the slide. And when we talked, Rick, decades later, was clearly really shaken by this. And then he talked about Doug Tompkins. This was just some 6 months after Doug had died in Patagonia, after the double kayak that Rick and Doug were paddling flipped in a gale. Rick nearly died too. It was a terrible and traumatic disaster. Rick, not surprisingly, was still deeply upset. We were basically near strangers having lunch together. I think both of us may have been a little verklempt. And yet, as he was talking, he also talked about how while he, Rick, was drowning, or while he thought he was drowning, he decided to look around. He told me, I'm quoting him here, "I did something I'd never done. I gave up. I assumed I was dead. So I decided to take it all in, the lake, the mountains, the sky. It was so deeply beautiful, I felt good about it." Now that's optimism. So may I introduce my favorite optimist, the incomparable Rick Ridgeway. You can
Thanks so much, Nick. That was terrific. Thanks all of you for coming here this evening. It's really wonderful to be back here in this clubhouse with so many familiar faces, and many of them are some of my closest friends. Nick mentioned that K2 trip when we were coming back home through New York. We received a message that any of us on the expedition, especially the few of us who had reached the summit, were invited to come on the Today Show. And we'd been away for nearly 5 months, and nobody wanted to do it except me. And they sent a car over and dropped me off at Rockefeller Plaza. And coming off the mountain, I hadn't had time to really get a new set of clothes, so I had a beat-up Aloha shirt on. I had stopped in the Rawalpindi Bazaar and bought some Pakistani pajama pants. I had to have flip-flops on because my toes were frostbitten, and the young escort who greeted me recoiled when I put out my hand because my hands were black from frostbite, and the skin was peeling off my face. When I was introduced to Tom Brokaw, who's right here with us in the front this evening. I've been doing this show for a long time, Tom said. There's never been anybody come on looking anywhere close to how you look. But we hit it off. And afterwards in the green room, he said, I've always been fascinated with climbing, and even the idea of maybe trying it myself. And I said, well, I got this buddy of mine named Yvonne Chouinard, so you come out to Wyoming this summer and we'll take you up the Grand Teton. And I thought about this even this morning. I was telling somebody the same story this morning, and it was in the context of how some people have fate and luck. But you know what it really is? It's when I met you and I just felt from you, your commitment and interest in this, and I said, come out. But the real thing is that you did it. And it changed both of us. We both had a different direction than we would have if I hadn't offered that and you hadn't taken me up on it. So let me read you the first paragraph from the prologue of my new memoir, Life Lived Wild. I once calculated that I've spent over 5 years total time sleeping in tents, and most of that in small tents, pitched in the world's most remote regions. And I say that not to boast, but to offer it as a measure of time spent deeply connected to wilderness, because that connection has shaped the way I've lived my life, teaching me to distinguish what I call matters of consequence from matters of inconsequence. Treading water that's 39 degrees when you think you're going to die, and then deciding to take in the beauty of the wild world is a matter of consequence. And I'm assuming everybody here tonight can benefit from knowing better how to separate things that are consequential from those that aren't. And if you think about it, you might come to the same conclusion I have, that maybe there's nothing more important in our own lives than knowing how to do that. And I'm not claiming at all that I've got it figured out by any means, because it's all a journey, as they say. I'm on the same one you guys are. But my own journey started as a teenager when my mother gave me a subscription to National Geographic, and I read that cover story about the first American ascent of Mount Everest. And this was in 1963, and inside was that photo of Jim Whittaker, the first American to reach the top, and I decided that's who I wanted to be. So I bought an ice axe and crampons, just like Jim's, and an instruction manual how to use them, and that sent my mother's maternal radar beeping pretty loudly. So as a high school graduation present, she sent me to Outward Bound in the Oregon Cascades, where I learned some basic mountaineering skills, and I was more hooked than ever. So I started to use every dollar I could earn doing odd jobs to climb in places like Yosemite, and I started going to Peru, where I learned the fundamentals of high-altitude mountaineering, and I met another climber that was, quite a bit more experienced than me, named Chris Chandler, and he took me under his wing. And a year later, he called, and he said, us both on an expedition to the Himalayas. And I mean, the Himalayas. It had been my dream to somehow, someday, some way, get to the Himalayas. And I said, what's the mountain? Well, he paused, which I realized was for effect, before he said, Everest. And I remember my first reaction was, might as well start at the top and work down. But that National Geographic article I had read when I was in my early teens about Jim Whittaker and the first American ascent of Everest, and there I was at age 25 following in those guys' footsteps. And the expedition was filmed for a television special, and the camera crew followed Chris and me through the Khumbu icefall, the most dangerous part of the climb, as I know many of you know. Then today, Sherpas, of course, put the route in for clients that, as you also know, can pay like $100,000 to say they climbed Everest. But back then, we had to really figure this out for ourselves.
1247, September 2nd. In only 4 days, they have built a route through the icefall where it has taken some expeditions weeks. But the top of the icefall is hardly the summit of Mount Everest.
So for the next 3 weeks, we made good progress up the mountain, and then a week later, I was on my way to the summit. But then, just at the 26,000-foot level, my lungs started to congest, and I had no choice. I had to turn around and go down. But my climbing partner, Chris, went on to reach the top. You see him in hurricane winds, holding onto that tripod the Chinese had put up there the year before. And with that, the expedition was over, and I started the long journey home down the mountain, wondering, if I had what it was going to take to be a high-altitude mountaineer. And if I tried another big mountain, would I have the same issue with my lungs? And I had a chance to find an answer to that question a year later when I got a call from this guy, Jim Whittaker, my boyhood hero. And Jim was leading an expedition to K2, the second highest peak on the planet. And I know, as many of you know, they regard the hardest high-altitude mountain in the world to climb, and it's a really good thing we didn't know that back then. Because even the trek to base camp was hard. It was 110 miles. 4 months, the trek, climb. And after here, uncertainty, not knowing if that was going to happen again when once again I got up high. And even if I stayed healthy, there was just the challenge of the mountain. So we set up our base camp, and the weather happened, and we started up. 14 of us on the team, and unlike Everest, there were no Sherpas. And after we set up Camp 1 and then Camp 2, some of the team carried supplies while others of us put the mountain. And we were now ready to tackle this, the knife edge, a ridge that is almost a mile long and an average elevation of 23,000 feet. And we only managed to get started, however, when the weather turned. And at first we stayed in our high camp, hoping that the storm was going to be short, but we're eating food and burning fuel that we had worked really hard to carry up. So after another 4 days, we had no chance to go down all the way to camp. And the storm lasted over a week, and when it cleared, we had to work hard to get back to it. Finally, we were ready for that knife, also the China. After 4 days, get to the other. There was no, so we had to hack the top precisely to the ridge, so you actually had to crawl through the tents to get from one end of camp to the other. But we were ready to push to the next camp, and before we could even get started, the next storm hit. And again, no choice but to go all the way back down to base camp. And when we start the summit head wall, and we've been this over a month. So the next camp at 25,000 feet, and we only arrived in the. Just want to make sure. And I'm trying to project like Nick did, but Nick, I just had trouble at high altitude. I didn't quite have the lungs that you might have for it. But the next storm hit, and once more it was all the way down to base camp, and this one lasted another week. And with each day, all of us had to struggle to safeguard our optimism and our commitment. And when it cleared, there were 4 of us picked to make an 11th hour attempt at the top. And at this point, we were really out of food and supplies. And we put in one more camp at 26,000 feet, and the weather held. 1,000 feet were ice. Oxygen. It's hard to make depth. But finally, shot there of the summit. Can't see it. Be important, and I should try to figure out how to remember it. But all I could think about energy to get back down, and it was on a little bit of a snow knob, so I had to climb uphill for just a few short feet. I couldn't do it, and I had to get down and crawl and reach out with my hands and actually pull myself along. And I remember my two companions standing there in the tent, and one of them looked at the other guy going, "Wow, look at Rick, he's crawling." The other guy goes, "I wonder if he's going to make it." But finally we got back to base camp, to our colleagues and friends, and we'd been at this point above 18,000 feet for 68 days. It had taken pull it off, and I'd lost so much weight I could actually steps. That morning, below zero on our thermometer, and my fingers, and finally, the only real bad outcome was when that young woman at NBC had to try to shake my hand before I interviewed with Tom. We made it. It was the third ascent of two. Nobody since then, we climbed high altitude. Really knew that it have them. Exploring such an unknown area with a team of really friends. Jonathan Wright. Oh, one day we were caught in it. Arms and buried him under rocks next to where he died, and we went into a. Should I keep? No, if I. It took me a couple of years to think it through, to think about what I'd learned, what I'd taken from and down life. What about how to make sense, and then always happened, and you had to adjust your plan, and how I had to learn to be tenacious to a degree I never even knew I could possibly own, and I just about the difference of my face and son, the side that was in way. I was feeling like I'd been reborn into a new awareness of really what it meant to be alive, and with that awareness, a real understanding for all of us how quickly we can not be alive. And a few years later, I ran into that poem that I really famous last line, poem Summer's Day, when she said, what are you going to do with you? And summarize the I was going to go back to climbing. Meanwhile, my professional life as a writer and a photographer was still in front of me, and Jonathan's family asked if I would complete a story for National Geographic that he and I had been working on when he died. And his wife and his parents asked me, and I agreed to do it for them and for his baby daughter, who was only a year old when he died in my arms. So I went back to Kathmandu, and I was in the bar at the Yak and Yeti, going first class with National Geographic. And there was this beautiful woman in the lobby, and I bought her a drink, and she wanted to know where I lived. And I said, well, I got this really quaint beach cottage just south of Santa Barbara, when the truth was it was a surfer shack on a low-rent beach just north of Oxnard. But the line worked, and less than a year later, Jennifer and I were married, and I come to realize that it wasn't a coincidence that I'd made this shift in my life so soon after Jonathan had died in my arms, and so soon after I'd nearly died myself. And it wasn't a chance that Jennifer and I started our family right away. And that, of course, made it a lot more difficult to decide whether to go back to mountaineering. But mountaineering was what I did, and so much of who I was from my time in the mountains and my time in nature. And even with a family, I was still wrestling whether the rewards were worth the risk. And then I wondered if the right people came along with the right project, would I consider going back? And what would Jennifer think? And then it happened when I got a call from these two guys, Frank Wells on the right. Some people know these in the back of the room, Mary Jo. And Frank was president of Warner Brothers, and Dick Bass, next to him, owned the Snowbird Ski Resort. And by coincidence, they shared the same dream to try and climb the highest mountain on each of the 7 continents, which nobody had ever done before. And they didn't have much climbing experience. They were just both almost 50, so I assumed it was some kind of a midlifer. But I also was intrigued by these guys, and so were some of my buddies like Yvonne there teaching Dick Bass how to ice climb. So I accepted their offer, and I went to Jennifer and talked to her, and she said, well, before I accepted it, I went to Jennifer and talked to her, and she said, you know, maybe what you got to figure out is what's going to happen if you don't go. And what's going to happen if you don't get to know these guys, and where your life might not go if you don't learn something from them instead of you guiding them. Well, maybe it wasn't the first time in my life that I would learn that 1 + 1 is a lot more than 2 in a marriage. So I went on the 3 of the climbs to Aconcagua and Everest, and at the end of the year to Vincent Massif. And on Aconcagua, we all made the top, including my buddy Yvonne Chouinard, who was with us. And then from there I went to Everest. But on Everest this time, my role wasn't as guide, but and Mary Jo, you'll get a kick out of this. Mary Jo's in the back of the audience. She was my partner on this expedition because we were both the producers of the film. And in addition, I had the hat of being Tom, you'll like this, the color commentator. Here we are at 26,000 feet. Dick, tell me how you're feeling. But neither Dick nor Frank made the summit. But they didn't pause to continue climbing the highest mountain in North America and Africa, Australia. Here you see them on top of Mount Elbrus, the highest peak in Europe. And the last on the list was Vincent Massif, the highest mountain in Antarctica. And I came again on this climb, this time as a guide. And we were the first private expedition ever to reach the interior of Antarctica. And we all made the summit. This is me on top of Vincent in what was only the third ascent ever of the mountain. But Frank and Dick had missed Everest, and Frank had to go back to work, this time running Disney. And Dick returned to Everest, missed it again, but then, as he said, the third time works the charm. So at age 55, he was at that time the oldest guy to reach the top of Everest and the first to ever climb the 7 summits. And down at base camp, he called me on the satellite phone, and he said, "Rick, it just goes to show you," his voice was so, strained. "It goes to show you that the second half," and that was his shorthand for life after 50, "the second half can be and should be the best half." So Jennifer was right. I was learning more from these guys than they were getting from me as their guide. And I was committed to continuing my path, going to the wild places in the world. And I also had to commit to being there for my family. And that by no means was easy. And it wasn't without friction. But we made it work, Jennifer and me. Me focusing on my filming and photography and writing about my life lived wild. And it wasn't just the mountains either, but it was in jungles where on this trip we made the first crossing of Borneo at its widest point, 800 miles across as the hornbill flew, but closer, I guess, to 2,000 if you followed all the winds and bends in the rivers. And then on another jungle adventure, our objective was a secluded granite spire that rose over 2,000 vertical feet out of the Amazon in a region of jungle that was itself 80 miles past the last Yanomami village. And that was a village that had been visited by anthropologists only in the last decade. So we hired several of these Yanomami to help us porter our loads. And one day one of them dropped his pack and ran off into the jungle. And I followed him and realized that in the distance he'd heard a troop of monkeys. And he started this monkey pantomime dance to lure them in with curiosity. And it worked. He drew his arrow, shot, but missed. But then something else happened, because I got this guy's image in my head in a way like a song that gets stuck, you can't ever get rid of. And it was because I was looking for the first time in my life at the guy that I used to be. There were more adventures, including one in Africa, climbing Kilimanjaro, the highest peak on that continent, as you know. But the summit was where this trip just started, because from there we walked due east all the way to the Indian Ocean, crossing the bushlands of the twin Tsavo national parks that together are about the size of Israel. And it was a 600-kilometer trek on foot at eye level with animals that put us a few rungs down the food chain. And it led me to a reflection on conservation, on the efforts around the world to save wildlands and wildlife. And that led to another expedition using my outdoor skills to try and save this species, the shiryu, an antelope-looking creature that's actually a goat that lives in the most remote margins of the Tibetan plateau. And the animals were endangered because poachers were killing them for their fur that was being woven into these really expensive shawls that had become a fashion hit in places like your city here in New York. And the biologists were concerned that if the poachers discovered the animals' calving grounds, it'd be game over for this endangered species. And each summer, those females migrated to some unknown place to have their babies. And the biologists needed to discover where it was so that they could persuade the Chinese to protect it. But it was an area completely uninhabited, and you just couldn't get there. But what if my climbing buddies and I followed the migration on foot, carrying our supplies in custom-built rickshaws? Well, we had to walk nearly 300 miles, and at the start, each cart weighed 275 pounds. The average elevation was 16,000 feet, and every day we were eating more calories than we are using more calories going out than we're going in. This is my colleague on this trip, Conrad Anker, known as one of the world's toughest mountaineers, flat out on his back. But finally, after a month, we reached this high, snow-dusted plateau, and then there were thousands of Shiru congregated in a place safe to have their babies. And we documented the calving grounds and wrote an article for National Geographic, and we made a movie for National Geographic. It was actually Jimmy Chin was the kid on the trip, and it was his first movie. And the publicity convinced the Chinese to create a protected area around the calving grounds. And since then, the Shiru have been increasing. And the conservation of wildlife and wildlands became increasingly, for me, the center part of my life and my focus. And it wasn't just trips like this, but it was trips like this that had really been at their headwaters inspired by my mentors, by people like Tom here, and also probably the two biggest influences of all from my climbing companions, Yvonne Chouinard on the right and his partner, Doug Tompkins, on the left. And these two and started climbing together. And they had also both founded outdoor companies. Doug had started making sleeping bags and packs and parkas and jackets and called his new company the North Face. And then a few years later, Yvonne started his own company that he called Patagonia, a name that he'd given to the company because of an adventure that he and Doug had made there when they were both still in their late 20s. And that adventure had a huge influence on me. And it had a huge ripple impact on everybody else who was an outdoor person that I knew.
And picked up a 16mm Bolex camera to record the trip. Loaded the car up with surfboards and climbing gear and took off for a 10,000-mile trip down south. I think from the time we decided to go, it was like 2 weeks before we went. We bought this old van and took off from Ventura. 1968, you got to remember the Pan American Highway was pretty wild. It was dirt road from Mexico City all the way south. It was like being in Montana or Wyoming 100 years ago. Here we're in an area that's the size of the whole American West, with no people.
For those of us that grew up going out into the wilds of the world, where nature was basically untouched, we got into our souls a sense of beauty.
That trip had a big influence on both Doug and I. It kind of set the course for what we were going to do later in life. For me, it was the best trip of my life.
Well, shortly around the time of that trip, Doug sold the North Face and put the money into his wife's, Susie's, women's wear business, and they decided to call the company Esprit and built that into a $1 billion brand. But then, even then, it was that beauty of nature that Doug mentioned that was the central source of the design ethic for the company. And I learned so much from Doug, including a phrase that I passed to Jimmy Chin when Doug told me one time, you know, Rick, you just got to commit and then figure it out. When I invited Jimmy to be the cameraman on that trip to find the sheer route, he said, I've never made a film before. And I said, Jimmy, commit and then figure it out. But Doug was getting pretty disillusioned with making a lot of stuff that nobody really needed. And when his marriage fell apart, he sold his half of the company and he moved to a remote part of southern Chile, to Patagonia, the place, and started buying wildlands to convert them into national parks. And then he fell in love with a named who ran Yvonne's company. And she was also one of my best friends. I'll just say she's the only other person than my wife who was in the delivery room for the birth of all three of my kids. That kind of friend. And she fell in love with Doug and married him and resigned from the company and moved south and joined him. And the two of them would go on over the next 25 years to create over 16 million acres of new national parks in Chile and Argentina. It's the biggest conservation victory ever by private individuals in the history of conservation. And I was privileged, and Yvonne was, to have a small part in that, as Tom was. Also, we all joined in to help out. But then I also joined Yvonne's company, Patagonia. And, you know, like Doug and Yvonne, I used the lessons I'd learned in nature, in wilderness and wildness as a climber and explorer to really run the company along those same principles. And that was why Patagonia was fundamentally in business to use business as an agent for environmental protection, because it wasn't about making shit that nobody needs. It was about using the fact that you guys are still buying it, whether you need it or not, to try and save the world. And that's where the mission comes from. That's what Patagonia does, and that's why it exists. And it was a privilege for me to be there for 15 years working with incredible people, all committed to the same hierarchy. And those people included interns every summer. Each summer we had a dozen interns that joined us. We also each summer had about 10,000 applications, so that getting an intern position at Patagonia was harder than getting into Harvard by a long ways. And one year, those interns included a young woman who was an active outdoor athlete who at the same time had just turned 20, been only a year old when her father, Jonathan, had died in my arms. And he had named her Asia because we had I had grew up trying to be fill-in fathers, and now she was an intern, and I knew before the summer was going to want to know about her father, because after he died, her mother had shut his memory out of their lives. And sure enough, she said she wanted to have a chat. And I didn't hold back. I told her about her father, about the avalanche, about how I'd held him, looked into his eyes, gave him mouth-to-mouth as he made his last breath. And I'd stroked his hair, pledging to be there for her. And then she said, that wasn't why I'm here. It's because I have a favor. I want you to take me back to that mountain where my father died, and I want to climb up it, and I want to find him. So I told her I needed to think about that. And I went to my wife, and I asked Jennifer what I should do, and she said, what do you mean? You're going. Because Asia's not asking you just to find her father. She's asking you to be her father. And I knew that if Jonathan had lived, he would have taken his daughter on some of the trips he was on, and certainly those trips would have included Asia, the place. So that's what Asia and I did. We, across Nepal and Tibet, we trekked with Sherpas who had been my friends, that had been her father's friends, who were now her friends. In western Tibet, we ascended an unclimbed 21,000-foot peak in near hurricane wind conditions. And then on to eastern Tibet, we approached the flank of Minyakanka, where her father had died, and it had been 20 years. And I wasn't sure I could, but finally on a high, barren slope, we found it, only now it had been disturbed, probably by a snow leopard. So Asia and I gathered up his bones, and we reburied him and made our own prayers and our own thanksgiving. And the full trip, it was not a trip, it was a pilgrimage. The pilgrimage took a couple. In those months, I told her the stories I knew. There, stories I've told you about how you have to learn how to make plans and know how to keep putting one foot in front of the other, to dig deep for that tenacity that you need, and you need to know to go about your life knowing that it's not about the summit, but as I said earlier, it's the footsteps, the process. It's the way that you get there. That's the goal. And that in your work life, as well as your home life, your life has to have a purpose, I told her. And that purpose needs to be more than just about you, but about how you can be more than just yourself. So, knowing at all.
Rick, I've got to ask you this question. Maybe somebody here is a doctor. Does anybody know how long he was collapsed? That was pretty incredible. So just so everybody, projector off and maybe turn the lights back on. We're just speak a short while, and then we'll take some questions. A lot of you are going to personally, and you'll have that opportunity around the club. So I'll keep this a little on the short side, and it's maybe more of an annoyance. Put it right here.
Yeah.
Hey, Rick, no doubt you are a world-class climber athlete, right? And that's stating the obvious. But, when I was hearing your story, I thought perhaps your greatest skill or strength was your ability to pick people. I think that somehow, if just looking at who your people that you sort of aligned as friends, your choices of friends throughout your life seemed to be uncanny. I mean, we went through there, and it was like one really successful and well thought out and ethical person. Have you ever really thought about that?
Yeah, the real reason was that I wasn't world class at all, but I was never as good as those guys were, and I needed them to help me get through it all. I was never the most talented climber with the sort of innate skills that so many of my friends and companions had. I couldn't climb nearly as good as Conrad, nor Jimmy, and probably not as good as most of the people I was with. But I did have an instinct, I suppose, for figuring out how to get myself in with the most talented people. But it wasn't just their skills as climbers, but it was really, who they were, what was going on inside of them. And I was also willing at times, many times, to go on trips where I had a off to the side position, making a movie or writing a story where it was about somebody else. But I learned early on that the real value of those opportunities was in the time I was spending with these people and getting to know them and getting to see these most remote places on our planet when they were still deeply, deeply wild. And so if I've had a privilege in my life that really stands out, it was that opportunity to see and witness and bear witness to the last wild places on our beautiful home planet.
In our era of sort of instant fame and gratification or self-promotion, there's something really wonderful in a story that has humility with it. And I want to say this, that Ed Hillary stood pretty much in the same spot and talked about his imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
That when he was a kid in New Zealand, that he was put in he moved to a new school, he was in the 6th grade, and he was so skinny and bony, they put him in a gym class for kids who had handicaps.
Yeah.
And even in his 80s, that idea that he wasn't really up to snuff never left him.
Yeah. Ed wasn't actually a very good climber either, kind of like me. No, I mean, I'm serious. He was not the hot guy on the team, but he had that inside thing to just, he had what it took to recognize his own weaknesses and figure out, how to be with the right people and how to overcome them. He really did. I know, I never climbed with Ed. I mean, I used to know him. We hung out a bit and out there in his projects in Nepal. But Yvonne he climbed with Ed a little bit. And he said, oh, the guy nearly killed me one time,
Maybe his gym teachers were right.
But think about what he did. And, the fact that he might not have been the best climber on the team makes it all the more impressive for me. Yeah. And he was humble that way, wasn't he? Him too.
He was like in his right to his dying day. If you wanted to take a picture, sign an axe. I know a lot of his philosophy on that. But it's interesting. We were talking beforehand, and being a member here, you have the privilege of meeting people who walked on the moon, and people who have summited Everest and K2. And I remember Scott Carpenter, an astronaut, told me that when he did his Mercury mission, leading up to the expedition, everything is about you. Everything is about you. And all you had to do is focus on yourself. And he said, when the mission was over, suddenly it's not about you. And I had said to you that I found a different type of person, climbers, because they do spend a large time as a team that depends on each other. And most great climbers were guides, and as a guide, you got to get along with people, right? And so, if you ask me the difference between explorers, between the astronaut and the climber, ultimately at the end of the day, the climber seems like they at least have that ability to get along with people.
Yeah, maybe there might be a bit in that. And back in the days when I was, really in the 60s and 70s, when that was my central focus, mountaineering and adventure and exploring, the other people drawn to it, the guys that I started, and women I started hanging out with, it was total counterculture. Where we lived in Camp 4 in Yosemite, Yvonne coined that word dirtbag, and God, that's what we were, like groveling. We used to go to the cafeteria in the Yosemite Lodge, and we would, get a cup of tea, get the lowest price thing on the menu, like tea or coffee or something, just sit there and wait for somebody to leave their food, and then you just get right in. And that's really who we were. Patagonia was almost $1 billion company. It was,
I don't want to hear that he was a billionaire and he was still doing the same thing.
Well, let me finish my story. So, and you probably heard this story from Melinda, Meredith, and Tom, but they're in this restaurant in Santa Barbara, this fancy restaurant, and there's a guy next to him eating a dinner by himself, and he gets up and leaves, and he's left half of his dinner on his plate. And Melinda looks at Yvonne and says, "Don't even think about it."
Old habits are...
And Yvonne goes, "But look at, like scallops. There's scallops." And he just left, And she's going, so Yvonne gets his plate and starts eating the guy's scallops when he comes back from the bathroom. She tried to buy the guy the most expensive bottle of wine. It didn't work. He was so pissed that
But there's something really cool about that.
She had to leave. Yeah, but that's not, typical, like, CEO behavior. We were dirtbags. We still are dirtbags in a way. So
it's interesting. You mentioned culture, and we're at a time sort of in history for kids growing up. Like your story of saving that National Geographic, I've heard that story from so many people here. They said, "Man, when I was a kid, I used to read this, that." For the first time in human existence now, for a kid, you've met my 2 11-year-old boys, it's as interesting to hang out indoors than it was to go outdoors. So do you see sort of that, everybody likes to wax about the good old days, but do you see that culture shift?
Well, you're thinking about the cover of National Geographic. I got a good story about that if you want another story. Sure. And Rebecca Martin, my former colleague at National Geographic, she loves this story. But, you heard how that article in National Geographic in the 1964 issue about the 63 expedition, that's where my inspiration came from. And after the K2 climb, I was a year later on the cover of National Geographic. I was a photograph of me climbing that knife edge for the cover story about our K2 ascent. And then years later in 1999, I was working for National Geographic as a filmmaker, documenting Conrad and Alex Lowe, his rope partner, climbing a overhanging 2,000-foot wall in Antarctica, this giant rock spire. First wall climb ever done in the frozen continent. And halfway up, a storm came in, and we had to rappel off the peak. And in our base camp, just waited out. So we're sitting around, drinking coffee, telling stories. And Conrad says, "Rick, there's something I've been meaning to tell you, but when I was about 13 or 14 years old, I got my National Geographic that my parents had given me, and there was this picture of you on the summit, or on the ridge climbing K2, and I just said, I want to be that guy." And a year later after that, there was a cover story on our rock climb in Antarctica, and Conrad was on the cover. And I called him up and I said, guess what? And he says, I think I know what you're going to tell me, but say it anyway. And I said, there's a 13-year-old girl or boy out there getting their magazine in the mail, and you know what's going to happen. Yeah.
How wonderful is it to hear these kind of stories in person? You can Zoom all you want or even watch television, but when you somehow see the expression of a person telling a story, in the flesh around the fire, it's so much more gratifying.
Yes.
I'm getting the high sign from Rebecca that, Martin, that, we do want to sign books and be able to talk in person afterwards. So we do have a tradition here that I think is one of the most wonderful traditions. And, we always give a certificate of appreciation. And, this is more than a piece of paper, and it's more than just the gratitude of 100 people here or an organization of 3,000. But, when I hear stories like this, you say there are people who make the world definitely a better place to live. And the world is so thirsting for authenticity and heroes and people who have solid values and a conscience to what they do. And Rick, you check all of those marks so perfectly. So on behalf of everyone, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I know they want you to sign some books. Okay. So I want to remind everybody the holidays are coming up. Somebody's birthday, if you can't get enough books here, you can always order on Amazon. Where are we finding it?
Patagonia.
Patagonian books. Patagonian books. Wanted to get that message out. So, you're gonna.
Yeah, I'll go out there and
come chat. Thank you all for coming. It's so wonderful.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you very much, Rick. Now.